There is a signal that appears exactly 11 months before every major empire collapses. Not 10 months, not 12 months, 11. It showed up in Rome in 409 AD. It appeared in Constantinople in 1452. It flashed in London in 1955. And 3 weeks ago, it just activated in Washington, D.C. Most people have never heard of this signal because the people who recognize it don't talk about it publicly. They simply act on it. They quietly liquidate positions, move assets offshore, and prepare for what's coming. The signal isn't economic data that you can find in government reports. It isn't a stock market indicator that appears on financial news. It's something far more subtle and far more dangerous. It's the moment when an empire's ruling class stops believing in their own system. You have to understand something about how empires actually fall. They don't collapse because of external enemies. They don't fall because of natural disasters or technological disruption. Empires collapse when the people who run them lose faith in the very mechanisms that gave them power. When the emperor realizes the crown is worthless, the empire is already finished. Everything else is just paperwork. The signal first appeared in the historical record during the final days of the Western Roman Empire. In March 409 AD, something unprecedented happened in the imperial court. For the first time in Roman history, senators began quietly converting their wealth from Roman currency into barbarian gold. Not because they thought the barbarians would win, but because they no longer trusted their own monetary system. These weren't peripheral senators from distant provinces. These were the Cornelii, the Julii, families whose ancestors had built the empire. The conversion followed a specific pattern. First, liquid assets, then land transfers to Germanic merchants, finally placing their sons in barbarian courts as insurance policies. 11 months later, Alaric sacked Rome. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Those senators didn't convert their wealth because they received intelligence about barbarian military plans. They converted because they had access to imperial financial records. They could see something that ordinary Roman citizens couldn't see. The empire was spending 6 times more than it collected in taxes. The silver content in Roman coins had dropped to less than 3%. The military was mutinying because they were being paid with worthless metal. The senators realized that Rome wasn't being conquered. Rome was collapsing from within. The same signal appeared in Byzantium. In June 1452, exactly 11 months before Constantinople fell to Mehmed II, Byzantine aristocrats began liquidating their assets and moving wealth to Venetian banks. They weren't fleeing because they feared Turkish cannons. They were fleeing because they had seen the imperial treasury records. The empire that once controlled trade routes from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean was collecting less tax revenue than a single Italian city-state. Venetian banking records show Byzantine nobles weren't just moving money. They were purchasing Venetian citizenship for their children. The Palaiologos family had already secured safe passage to Italy months before the siege began. 11 months later came the fall. Fast forward to the 20th century. In July 1955, British intelligence began Operation Legacy, the secret destruction of colonial documents across the empire. But hidden within this operation was something more significant. Senior members of the British establishment started converting pound sterling holdings into Swiss francs and American dollars. 11 months later came Suez, the crisis that revealed to the world what the British elite already knew. Britain was no longer a superpower. It was a debtor nation pretending to still rule the waves. The signal isn't about economics. Economics is just the symptom. The signal is about psychology. It's the moment when the people who benefit most from a system realize that the system is no longer sustainable. When the insiders become the first to head for the exits. Now look at what's happening in America today. 3 weeks ago, something happened that should have made headlines, but didn't. The Federal Reserve quietly began allowing primary dealers to post gold as collateral for overnight lending operations. This is unprecedented. For decades, the Fed has only accepted Treasury securities and agency debt. Gold was specifically excluded because the dollar was supposed to be the ultimate store of value. The Fed accepting gold as collateral is equivalent to the Vatican accepting Protestant theology. It means the institution has lost faith in its own doctrine. But that's just the beginning. Over the past 6 months, a pattern has emerged that mirrors exactly what happened in Rome, Byzantium, and Britain. American institutional investors have been quietly diversifying away from dollar-denominated assets. Not retail investors, not foreign governments, American institutions. University endowments have increased their allocations to foreign currencies and hard assets by 40% in the last year. Yale's endowment now holds more Swiss francs than most central banks. Harvard has purchased farmland in New Zealand worth more than some countries' entire agricultural output. Corporate pension funds have been purchasing record amounts of real estate in Switzerland, Singapore, and New Zealand. Boeing's pension fund has acquired more property in Auckland than in Seattle. The pattern is unmistakable. The most revealing signal comes from insurance companies. AIG now holds more of its reserves in gold than in treasury bonds. These companies aren't making political statements. They're making actuarial calculations about American system stability. The most telling sign came from an unexpected source. In September, the Department of Defense quietly began accepting Bitcoin payments from defense contractors. This wasn't announced in press releases. It appeared buried in an 847-page budget document. The Pentagon is now conducting business in a currency that didn't exist 20 years ago. Defense contractors have been requiring payment in assets other than dollars for 6 months. Lockheed Martin accepting Swiss government bonds. Raytheon taking Canadian dollars. Boeing accepting gold bullion for classified contracts. The military-industrial complex is actively diversifying away from dollars. This is the 11-month signal. When the people who run the empire start protecting themselves from the empire, the countdown has begun. These people aren't unpatriotic. They simply have access to information that reveals the mathematical impossibility of the current trajectory. They can see the debt projections that show interest payments consuming 40% of federal revenue by 2025. The United States government now owes more money than has ever existed in human history. The total debt, including unfunded liabilities, exceeds $200 trillion. There is not enough money in existence to pay what America owes, which means the debt can only be serviced by creating new money, which destroys the value of existing money, creating an accelerating cycle that ends in hyperinflation or default. So they're doing what rational actors always do when they realize the game is rigged against everyone, including themselves. They're changing the rules by which they play. The Roman senators who converted to barbarian gold weren't traitors. They were realists. The Byzantine aristocrats who moved wealth to Venice weren't cowards. They were mathematicians. The British establishment figures who abandoned sterling weren't defeatists. They were historians. They understood that empires don't die from external shock. They die from internal recognition. The American version of this signal is different, because America itself is different. Previous empires were regional powers pretending to be global. America actually is global. When America's ruling class loses faith in American systems, there isn't another empire to flee to. There's nowhere to go except outside the system entirely. That's why the signal looks different this time. Instead of fleeing to rival currencies, they're fleeing to assets that exist outside any national currency system. Gold, real estate, commodities, cryptocurrency, anything that maintains value independent of government stability. The timeline is what makes this most dangerous. In Rome, the empire stumbled along for decades after the signal appeared, because the Roman economy was decentralized. Local regions could survive imperial collapse. In Byzantium, the empire contracted gradually because most of its territory was already autonomous. In Britain, the empire downsized because the colonies could function independently. America can't downsize gradually. The American system is too interconnected, too financialized, too dependent on confidence. Modern financial markets move at electronic speed. When confidence breaks, everything breaks simultaneously. The dollar is the reserve currency for 70% of global trade. American Treasury bonds are the foundation of the international financial system. American military power underwrites global stability. When the American elite stops believing in American systems, the world stops believing in American systems. The 11-month timeline has been consistent across empires, but the mechanism of collapse has accelerated with each iteration. Rome took months to fall after the signal because communication moved at horse speed. Byzantium took weeks because communication moved at ship speed. Britain took days because communication moved at telegraph speed. America will take hours because communication moves at internet speed. 11 months from the signal means we're looking at late 2024, early 2025, right around the time when interest payments on the national debt exceed discretionary federal spending. The people who are moving assets now understand that this isn't a choice between policy options. This is a choice between two types of collapse. The signal has appeared. The countdown has started. History suggests 11 months. Mathematics suggests the timeline might be shorter this time because the stakes are higher, the system more complex, the interconnections more fragile. What comes after isn't another empire rising to take America's place. What comes after is something human civilization has never experienced before. The collapse of the first truly global empire in an interconnected world. Consider the scope of American integration. The dollar isn't just America's currency, it's the pricing mechanism for oil, gold, wheat, and coffee. American Treasury bonds aren't just government debt. They're the collateral backing trillions in international contracts. When the American system fails, there isn't another system ready to replace it. The Roman Empire collapsed, but the Byzantine Empire continued. The British Empire declined, but America replaced it. When the American Empire ends, what replaces it isn't another empire. It's a return to a multipolar world that hasn't existed since before Rome, except this time with nuclear weapons and depleted resources. The Roman Empire fell, but Rome continued. The Byzantine Empire fell, but Constantinople continued. The British Empire fell, but Britain continued. When the American Empire falls, what continues is the question that keeps people awake at night. The 11-month signal has never been wrong. It appeared in Rome, in Byzantium, in Britain, and now in America. History suggests you have until late 2024. Mathematics suggests less time than that. The signal suggests the people who know the most about the American system have already made their choice. The question is, have you?